Welcome to FIL Your Boots, covering critical times of the season. FIL hosts industry experts, colleagues, and most importantly, local farmers like yourself, bringing you useful insights and different perspectives to help you drive performance on farm. Hello and welcome back to another episode of FIL Your Boots. I'm Ben Murphy, National Sales Manager for FIL, and today we're chatting to Colin May about bloat of all things. Bloat in Colin's day was pretty common, but it seems to have faded away and now it's come back again, Colin. So what is bloat?
I love the way you say in my day, Pete. It's as though I've been around a long time.
Wow. Say it how it is, Colin.
Well, I had been around a long time, and if I go back, Pete, to the 80s, I used to work in Taranaki. Like I remember one year we had an epidemic bloat year in those days, and we were losing 150 cows a day, and all hell broke loose. To be honest, there was a real panic. And if I look back to those times, even the 70s, farmers were actually driven off the farm through bloat. At the time, I worked in Waitra, where the farm source store is currently, and if I go back to those days, we sold 3 tonne of nitrogen a year at that time. If you then move to the 90s, nitrogen was introduced, we use a lot more of it. So what actually started happening is and palm kernel more recently has been plugging that feed gap. So what happens with bloat is bloat is the excessive production of gas in the rumen of a cow. What kills a cow from bloat is asphyxiation. It's the pressure on the heart and lungs. So what happens, you get to the spring, and particularly when farmers hit that second round and the grass starts growing really quickly, you got hungry cows, bump, that's when you're susceptible to bloat. So nitrogen and palm kernel plugged a lot of that. And I think the point you make is we're taking that out of the system now. So are we going to go back towards having more of it?
I think on that one too, we're seeing more clover coming through at the moment.
Yeah, I reckon that, you drive around now and it's phenomenal, isn't it? Whether the clover weevil's kicked in and we've got it, but this year seeing flowering clover, I've never seen anything like it. So you're right, that's going to actually, reinvigorate, could possibly put that challenge greater.
I guess there's many products on the market, but if we talk about bloat oil, what exactly does bloat oil do?
Yeah, it's a good question. If you go back to the 70s, 80s, how bloat oil was discovered was, believe it or not, was in a sewage treatment plant where a guy actually saw the foam. So in a sewage treatment plant, when they're stirring it, you get a lot of foam, and they were spraying a material onto the foam to knock the foam down. That turned out to be a marlophin that they were using. And from there, they started investigating and saying, well, if that broke down foam in a sewage treatment plant, can it do it in a cow? So that's how the evolution of bloat oil started. And if you actually, I've seen some funny things over my time, and tallow could be used also for treating bloat. And there was a farmer once at Artamuri. I've never seen anything so funny in my life. He used to get chicken fat from the delicatessen in Rotorua. He used to take it out there. I turned up one day and I saw this, and he had a burner. He used to heat the fat to solidify it, pour it in the back of his spray unit on the back of his four-wheeler, and then he used to go like hell around the paddocks to spread it with fat, because if you put the fat into the cow's rumen, it also broke down the foam. So you have tallow, you had fat, but more importantly now we have bloat oils which are pluronic based or alcohol ethoxylate based. And the alcohol ethoxylates were launched in the 70s by Cooper's at the time, was the first one. And now we have several on the market. So the reason they're more effective is in the rumen, they're more soluble, so the dispersion within the rumen with water is far greater. So your alcohol ethoxylates are the best ones, and then your pluronics are probably the second stage.
Yeah, just going back on that, I'll tell you now, I've been to that delicatessen and they were quite nice chickens too. But
yeah, well, they produce a lot of fat for that guy.
Types of application, I mean, there's different types of application, and we still get asked about spraying, etc. So what are the different types of application for bloat oil out there?
There's three main methods. You've got drenching, which actually was really prominent through the 80s. A lot of guys drenched. That's stopped now. Still a few people around, I think, drenching cows, which is quite effective. The main method now is through water trough treatment. So that's the main one. And if farmers are at a real pinch and can't do those methods, we can still spray. And you can spray with particularly alcohol ethoxylates.
We have two different types of bloat oil. Why? What are the differences in both of them?
Do you want to tell the audience what DFA means?
Designed for alkene.
Oh, well, that's not actually the one we normally use. Normally it's doesn't alkene.
Yeah.
So it doesn't actually deteriorate it. So we've got two. We've got DFA. I like Bede's explanation, but we do use another one. That doesn't damage low density alkene. So you got to remember we've got two types of alkene. I think from 2000 on, where farms were converted, they put in high density alkene. So that's more bloat oil resistant. But if you're in Taranaki, Waikato with older alkene, then you need a product that doesn't have alcohol ethoxylate. Always remember, alcohol ethoxylate will break down alkene and bloody quick. I've seen farmers put it through and within 2 to 3 days, you'll start springing water leaks.
Yeah, I've seen the same. And in actual fact, it almost becomes a sprinkler system. There's multiple leaks.
Yeah, you don't get a very good phone call.
No.
For some reason, it's quite often our fault.
Yeah, always.
Yeah.
I guess there's many mistakes. And when I say mistakes, we've almost got a whole generation of farmers that have not even experienced bloat. And some of the mistakes, like the common mistake is not being prepared, obviously. But what are the mistakes that you're seeing out there?
I'll tell you one of the funniest mistakes. There's a lot of mistakes, but one of the funniest ones I ever came across, and it was in Reparar in the 80s, a very prominent farmer down there. When you've got cows that are bloated, and you're right, B, there's a lot of young guys around, never been in this experience, but you walk into a paddock with bloated cows that are round as bulls, and they've got to be dealt to pretty easily, quickly. The method for doing that is to actually stab the cow in the side, just the left hand. Geez, I better be right on this. It's the left hand side. And I would say to listeners out there, observe your cows, because you'll see which side comes up first, which is the left hand side, and that's where the rumen is. So if you're going to stab a cow, you stab it in the left hand side, and that's quite a stressful time. A lot of people, they bloody panic with that. You haven't got much time to do it. But it was really funny in Reparar this day. I turned up and a farmer had 2 cows in the bale, and the vet turned up. And the vet came in, he said, well, I'm here to stitch up a couple of cows. Yep. He stitched up cows. He said, oh, there's 4, isn't there? He said, the farmer turned to him and said, no, there's not 4. There's actually 2 holes in each cow. I actually stabbed the wrong side to start with. So you've got to be a bit careful. So stabbing cows is one thing. Hopefully you never get to that. But you talk about mistakes. You've got to, bloat is going to happen typically at the start of the second round when you've got young grass starting to grow. One of the biggest mistakes farmers make is they don't pre-dose troughs. They don't start early enough. They start when they've got a problem. So pre-dosing is a big thing. That's probably the biggest mistake people don't make. And I also think low doses of bloat oil, you only have to start with water trough treatment at 4 mils a cow a day. Yeah. I think that's the big thing, is start dosing low and get it into the system. If you get it in the system and in the rumen, you will actually start building that in the cow's system. But also, those first rows of cows don't get bloat sometimes. Beware of troughs in the races to the paddocks. If you're just using a peter or a trough dispenser, you got to watch those.
So, they're not the not preparing troughs is a big one, because the first 3 or 4 rows that leave that shed are going to be drinking fresh water, because, as you say, it's the second round that hasn't given time. But I guess one of the bigger mistakes I see is not reading the labels and not knowing what to dose. So, as you say, if you keep on top of it at a lower rate, you're going to be in a better position. Every year we get a phone call about calves.
Are you implying farmers don't read labels, Pete? Are you implying anybody reads labels? You probably got a new TV and never read the manual.
I can tell you now that I read a Bloat label once a year. Yeah. So, but calves is a big one. Every year we get a phone call about calves, and I think last year we had a phone call from Taranaki, from vets.
Yeah.
And could you tell us about that one?
Yeah, look, calves are very susceptible to bloat and bloat oil. So if you have too high a concentration of bloat oil, that is, the calf drinks and goes into the rumen when the calf's rumen's not developed. And that's the key. It's when a calf's rumen is not developed and they're still drinking milk, they're really susceptible to bloat poisoning. And I think you've seen actually the best example of that.
Yeah, I have. I must admit I have. At Mangakino, I got a phone call asking what the symptoms were for bloat and calves, bloat oil, toxins in calves, and I told him, and he went, "Yep, that's pretty much it." And that farm itself hadn't transitioned those calves in properly, and he lost up to 90 calves on that bloat.
So those calves they were still drinking milk. And they were putting bloat all through their water systems, which meant the calves could get access to treated water.
Yeah. And the dose rate was for cows.
And it was a high dose rate.
Yeah.
So I think that's one of the biggest things with susceptibility with calves. Don't give them access to water treated with bloat oil when they're still fully fed on milk, because it's very toxic. How many did they lose on that occasion?
Up to 80 calves.
Yeah, that's pretty devastating.
And they were replacement calves. They weren't. Yeah.
Hey, Bede, what were the symptoms? What do farmers look at? What was the poisoning symptoms of those calves? What did they look like?
Well, the poisoning system was those calves were crunched up. So they were actually crunched up, as in they had real stomach tension, as in constipation or something like that. And they were real crunched up, and shortly afterwards, they were dead.
Upside down. Yeah, but they crunch up when
they crunched up, so it was extreme pain. So they crunched up in extreme pain, and then shortly afterwards, they were dead. The other thing is, we have come across farmers who have just cut the top off old bloat containers and used them as water. How common is that?
I think that's where the first instance of calves being poisoned was where a farmer cut the top off a bloat oil drum in a rush, didn't really rinse it out, filled it with milk, fed that to his calves. Bingo.
Yeah.
He killed I think he killed all of them that actually drunk out of that drum. So you got to be really careful in reusing those drums.
So a lot of times we hear that only hungry cows get bloat. But there is also the chance that late frosts, and you've come across it.
Yeah, I had been, and I think, late frosts, I think the worst example of that. What a frost does is it causes the grass to ferment quicker in the rumen. So the psychoplasmic proteins in clover and grass, all of a sudden with a frost on it, it actually lifts that sugar content and it ferments quicker in the rumen. And if there's one thing I'd say to people listening to this today, be really aware of frost, because particularly late, the worst example I had was in April in Nakuru, way back in the 90s, and a farmer had grazed a paddock. He was on 12-hour grazing. He put the cows back in it that night. The next morning he had 26 dead. And we had a frost that night, and the cows had gone out and regrazed that paddock, and bingo, it was a problem. So your bloat challenge will go along evenly, and a frost will spike it. and you've got to be really aware of that. Frost will create a bigger bloat challenge. So if you're dosing at 4 mils, 5 mils, that may not be enough to cover that and alleviate that problem at that time.
I think the big answer here to some of these farmers out here watching is, what is the price of your cow? What is it worth compared to a drum of bloat oil?
And I tell you what, I've had many farmers actually say, B, you're right, a cow's worth $2,000, drum of bloat oil's $2,000. But the other thing is too, if you dose at low levels of bloat oil, even if it's 1.5, 2 mils, I've had many farmers say to me, that just knocks the gas down. Cows are more comfortable and they actually produce better. So it is actually a mild treatment for those symptoms.
And a mild cost.
And a very low cost.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I guess the question we get asked every year is, are there additives going into the dosatron with bloat oil? And there is some out there that react.
Yep.
What's your take on some of these additives with bloat oil?
Look, this first surfaced in the 80s, I guess. What happens when you are treating bloat? The bloat oil has to go in the cow's rumen. Just before the rumen is the esophagus groove. And what was happening when farmers were drenching cows, particularly with copper. Copper was a really bad one for triggering that groove. So if your copper got too high, and not all cows this would happen, but quite often the copper would trigger the groove, and then the bloat oil then bypasses the rumen. So it doesn't end up in the rumen. So you've got no anti-foaming agent in the rumen to actually break down that foam. So copper's particularly bad. And I'd say to people, if you're in a really bad bloat situation, which sometimes we get into, might be for a period of a couple of weeks, copper, even through dosatrons, I think needs to be taken out because that can trigger it. Copper's the worst thing. Zinc, there's some documentation on zinc possibly triggering that esophagus groove, but copper's the bad one.
So then probably the answer there is, if in doubt, take it out and talk to your local FIL rep to see compatibility.
Yeah, I think that's what I'd always say. You take it out. I always say, if you've got bad bloat, get control of the bloat. That's the first priority. Deal to that. Take those other things out. They are needed, but first you've got to stop cows dying.
So you go out to your paddock and all of a sudden you've got a bloat problem and you're in crisis situation. How do you treat those?
Well, the first thing you got to do, you got to be careful. I've heard stories over the years, farmers say, oh, you run them around the paddock. Tell you what, if you had a guts ache and a hell of a lot of pressure in your heart and lungs, I don't think you'd want to run around a paddock. But I've had guys over the years say, yeah, chase them around in the four-wheeler. You don't do that. What you actually do, if you watch bloated cows, the first thing they'll do is they'll try and stand uphill, and that takes the pressure off their heart and their lungs. But the main thing is, if they're really bloated and you see cows in there, get them back to the shed and actually dose them with bloat oil. And the key on this is to use a little bit more bloat oil. So you might use 20 mils a cow, but mix that with a big volume of warm water. So you might mix that with 300 mils of water and try and dose that down the cow's throat. The more water you use, the better, because the rumen is all of a sudden expanded to the size of a 200-litre drum. You need a lot of water to carry that bloat oil around that vessel, which is the rumen, to break down the foam. That's the crucial thing.
And don't panic, just get stuck in.
Yeah, that's the hardest part. Don't panic. Yeah. It is a stressful situation, and that's where people do panic. And hey, if you've got to stab a cow, make sure you've got a good sheath on it. That's the other thing. I've seen people try and stab a cow and the knife will actually bounce off. But they're so tight. I've seen guys cut tendons down fingers. So if you ever got to do that, just don't grab the nearest knife. Make sure it's got a sheath on it.
Good advice. That's all for today, and thanks for joining us, Colin.
Cheers, Pete.
Thanks for tuning in to Fill Your Boots. If you'd like to learn more about the topics covered in today's episode, talk to your local FIL manager or head to fil.co.nz.